So in a moment, I'll pass over to Audrey Quicke from the Australia Institute, who recently finalised a scoping study with another excellent partner organisation to Better Futures Australia, the Climate Works Centre, Rachel Linsky, who has sent her apologies and is unwell today. So we're sending healing vibes and recovery vibes her way. And Audrey will outline some of the key interventions at a state and federal level that they identified for decarbonising Australia's transport sector, and identifying non-partisan advocacy opportunities for us all to put Australia on track for that ambitious climate agenda in the coming years. Following Audrey's summary of the scoping study, we'll welcome to the floor the three other excellent speakers you see, Claire, Peter, and then Kellie. And then we'll have around 15 minutes, hopefully, depending on the timing, for some discussion. So please do post any questions you have as we go in the chat. And an excellent intern and student from the University of Melbourne, Chloe, is in the chat, and she'll be streaming those questions to us to make sure there's responses. And any unanswered questions, we are hoping that this discussion continues throughout the next few months, so we'll keep this conversation going. First, a quick introduction for those of you new to Better Futures Australia. We are a 2-year-old non-partisan alliance involving climate champions from every sector of society and the economy: finance, business, agriculture, health, social service, faith groups, researchers, think tanks, local, state and territory governments, First Nations, unions, health workers, and more. And together we are calling for ambitious national targets and action, and reimagining our future by demonstrating scalable climate solutions and success stories already underway. This year, there's excellent work underway across Better Futures Australia's sector working groups, led by dozens of partner organisations, to use the first 100 days of the new Australian government at the Better Futures Forum on the 15th and 16th of August, to set an ambitious national climate agenda that puts us on track for a climate resilient, zero emissions and better future. And as highlighted in the recent IPCC report, and we have the pleasure of Peter, one of the lead authors for that, joining us today, transport is a priority emitting sector for Australia. So in setting that climate agenda, this topic today is really a key issue for us all. And in particular, the Better Futures Australia working groups from local government through to tourism and corporate supply chains have a lot of interest in this topic too. So the details of the Better Futures Forum and the policy dialogues generally around Better Futures Australia are taking shape. Please do register your interest via the link that Chloe is sharing in the chat to get involved and bring that forum to life. All right, I will hand over to Audrey. She is a researcher at the Australia Institute, working across the Climate and Energy Program and the Nordic Policy Centre. And her specialties include transport decarbonisation, electric vehicle policy, and hydrogen policy. Audrey also shared she spent the last weekend on an EV electric vehicle road trip to Outback Cobar, and all went smoothly, so she made it back to us. So thanks for joining us, Audrey.
Thanks so much, Lisa. And I'd also like to begin just by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm on. So I'm here in Canberra on Ngunnawal country. I pay my respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal Nation, both past, present and future, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. So thanks to Better Futures Australia for having us here to talk about a better transport sector for Australia. I'm going to mostly focus on that transport decarbonisation scoping study that was recently undertaken. And the purpose of that was really to outline these key transport interventions at both a state and a federal level. So it was commissioned by Better Futures Australia, and it was undertaken by myself with the Australia Institute and of course Rachel Linsky from Climate Works, who, as Lisa mentioned, unfortunately isn't able to be here. So I'm just going to speak briefly about Australia's transport emissions and the current policy settings, and then focus on some of those common transport policy asks that we identified within that scoping study. And then finally, just highlight some of the research and advocacy gaps that we identified within the scoping study. But first, why are we talking about transport? Well, because it's one of the highest emitting sectors in Australia. Transport emissions are rising, and there's really no federal policies in place at the moment to curb that. Currently, transport is the third largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Australia. So it produces around 18% of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. The majority of transport emissions are from road-based transport, so around 82%. And then 62% of transport emissions are from private passenger cars alone. Our transport system is not particularly energy efficient and it's not low carbon at the moment. It really focuses quite heavily on roads, both for passenger and freight movement, and also on personal vehicles. So in Australia, we've been quite slow to transition those vehicles to more efficient electric and zero emissions vehicles. And our use of public transport is low when you compare it to those comparable countries. So in terms of the current transport policy framework, there really hasn't been a strong focus on transport decarbonisation policy in Australia. I think when we look back, even over the past sort of decade or so, we see that it's really the electricity sector that's been the primary focus for decarbonisation efforts. And that's from governments, but also from the climate movement and a lot of businesses as well. And now we're sort of starting to see transport as this emerging focus for decarbonisation efforts. And I think a really prime example of that is the ACT government. So if you look there, they have this overarching goal of decarbonising, getting to net zero emissions by 2045, and then that interim target of 75% by 2030. And their initial focus was transitioning to that 100% renewable electricity system. Now that they've achieved that, transport makes up the bulk of their emissions. So it's around 60%, and they're really having to focus on transport policies. So increasing electric vehicle uptake through the sort of no interest loan schemes and waiving stamp duty and all those other policies they've recently introduced, and then also shifting to public transport use and active transport. So I think that we are likely to see a similar story in other states and amongst businesses and the climate movement, leveraging that momentum towards renewable electricity and then using that to power our transport system instead of foreign oil. So in Australia, there really isn't a federal policy to curb transport emissions. We don't have an electric vehicle strategy. Instead, we have this future fuels and vehicles strategy, which does offer, I guess, some guidance on transitioning fleets to zero emissions, but it also rules out a lot of the policies that we know would help make that shift. So fuel efficiency standards, for example, or incentives for electric vehicles. And because of that policy vacuum at the federal level, we've really seen a lot of that heavy lifting left to the states. The states are doing some good stuff. So we've seen some really useful EV policies coming out of state governments, like some of these rebates from New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, and Queensland for electric vehicles. Some states have committed to transitioning their bus fleets, New South Wales by 2030. And we're seeing some active transport policies coming from the states as well. But there is a really long way to go. So that brings me to the scoping study that we've just undertaken. The purpose of the study really was to map the known interventions in transport decarbonisation, as well as current and future transport asks. So it was really a way of understanding where things are at now in terms of advocating for transport decarbonisation and identifying those gaps and those future opportunities. So where can we go from here? So what we did was we reviewed some of the existing work that's out there, probably from a lot of your organisations, so from climate organisations, from unions, local government organisations. We identified some of those common policy asks, and then we conducted a number of interviews with stakeholders and organisations, and really just to get a picture of where groups are planning to move in this space. And from that, we were able to identify some research gaps and future opportunities. So just broadly speaking, we saw that some of the most common policy asks to date have been centred on electrifying and diversifying private passenger vehicles. That makes a lot of sense given their substantial contribution to transport emissions. But there is this sort of increasing attention now on active transport policy to encourage walking and cycling, and also on shifting to zero emissions buses, electric trucks and freight vehicles. So that's broadly speaking what we saw. And we were sort of able to classify most of the policy asks into kind of 6 broad areas. So the first one was purchase incentives for passenger electric vehicles. And that's because passenger vehicles are that substantial source of emissions, and because currently they are just more expensive upfront than your equivalent sort of ICE vehicle or internal combustion engine vehicle. So a lot of groups are asking for maybe upfront financial incentives So for instance, those $3,000 rebates that we've seen from some of the states, but we're not seeing that at the federal level. And realistically, those rebates really need to be more in that sort of $10,000 mark for EVs to be cost competitive at the moment. We also saw tax incentives for electric vehicles are another way of making them a little bit cheaper. So for instance, waiving import duties, stamp duty, adjusting the luxury car tax were quite common policy asks. And also redirecting Commonwealth fuel tax revenue towards zero emission subsidies was another one that we saw there. The second policy area that was quite common was calling for sort of setting procurement or sales targets for passenger EVs. So having those targets in place to transition both the Australia-wide fleet, but also government-specific fleets. So having like a EV sales target for the whole Australia fleet. So it's a zero emissions fleet by a certain date, for instance, 2030, but also calling on the federal government, state governments, and even local governments to transition their own government fleets. And that one's really important because it sends that really strong signal that this technology is viable, but it also creates that secondhand market because they don't hold on to those vehicles for that long and then they go into that secondhand market. And we also saw a lot of groups calling for bus fleet targets. So New South Wales, as I mentioned, has that 2031. Another very common and quite broad policy ask that we saw was fuel efficiency standards. So these are mandatory standards that would regulate the average CO2 across a fleet of vehicles. So a vehicle manufacturer would have to meet that average efficiency standard or they're going to be faced with penalties. And what that does is it acts to bring down the overall CO2 emissions and the fuel consumption. And then it incentivizes manufacturers to bring those EVs to the market. And it means households are paying less on their fuel. And we've got more electric vehicles available in Australia. So it's a really strong lever to reduce emissions. And there was really broad support across most of the people that we spoke to for the federal government to be introducing those fuel efficiency standards. The fourth sort of category that we identified was just additional electric vehicle enablers. So this was all the other policies that were brought up to encourage EV uptake. So things like targets to phase out fossil fuel powered vehicles, a comprehensive EV strategy. So that overarching policy framework that we don't have at the moment. Investing in charging infrastructure was a big one. And then encouraging local vehicle manufacturing. So whether that's component parts, the vehicle itself, or the charging infrastructure, manufacturing that here domestically in Australia. We also saw calls for use incentives as well. So things like giving EVs access to priority lanes or parking access. The fifth area that we saw was active and public transport policy. So as I mentioned before, less work has sort of been done in this space to date, but we're seeing that a lot of stakeholders are now sort of expanding their transport work into this area. So including those active and public transport asks and policies. So some really common ones here that we saw were asking for bike subsidies, whether that's a regular bike, an electric bike or a cargo bike, and possibly targeting those subsidies at bikes that are used for work purposes. We also saw calls for repurposing road space to prioritise active transport and dedicating a specific percentage of government infrastructure spending to go towards that public and active transport as well. So that was a really common one. And then finally, the last sort of group that we identified was truck and freight vehicle policies. So this, again, really hasn't been a central focus of previous transport work, but a number of stakeholders now moving into this policy area. And again, we sort of identified that there really hasn't been much focus on shifting freight movement from road vehicles to electric rail. So some of the common asks here were regulatory changes, so increasing the truck width limits, mandating emission standards, some incentives for installing charging infrastructure at depots, and providing purchase incentives for those zero emissions trucks and setting sales goals as well. So they were the sort of 6 broad policy areas that we really saw coming up again and again. And that was a really useful process to understand where things are at now, but then we also identified a number of gaps and then future opportunities going forward. So firstly, there were a few areas of knowledge gaps. So through this research, it was quite clear that despite a lot of the work on passenger vehicle electrification, there were still these gaps in some people's knowledge and a need to sort of understand some of the key technical information and policy asks to ensure consistent and effective campaign work. So an example of this was fuel efficiency standards. There was just a lot of confusion about what fuel efficiency standards were, how they differed from emission standards, how they differed from fuel quality standards. And that's within governments, that's within the climate movement, as within businesses, there's confusion everywhere about what these things are. We also saw that there was still this real need for federal purchase incentives for EVs. So even though a lot of work has been done in this space advocating for these incentives, we still don't have them at the federal level, and there wouldn't really be much additional research or resources required to continue advocating for them because so much effort has been put into this space. We also noted that there was a bit of an inconsistency across some of the state EV policies, that can sort of risk manufacturer confusion or an inability to provide consistent supply to the Australian market. So for example, road user charges that are targeted specifically electric vehicles, we see them coming through in some states, other states have deferred them, other states don't have them at all. So just quite a different policy landscape depending on which state you're in. We also saw that there has been significantly less work that's done in the active and transport space when you compare it to the electric vehicle space, although as I mentioned, lots of people are moving into that area. And then we also noted that we didn't touch very much on some of those equity considerations. So it's really great to have Kellie from ACOS here because there's so much work to build on here. We saw this gap in understanding how these interventions that reduce emissions could also be creating more efficient and accessible transport networks. So we really want to be bringing on those allies in social equity, accessibility, the health areas and so on. So we specifically identified the opportunity to work with stakeholders like ACOS and sustainable transport advocates to address those equity, accessibility and sustainability issues. Manufacturing and union cooperation was another sort of gap, but also opportunity that we identified. So we saw that future job and manufacturing opportunity narratives can be really compelling. And there are a number of transport related unions, but we sort of saw this lack of cohesive perspective or sort of engagement on transport decarbonisation. So a real opportunity to strengthen the connections between the unions and the climate organisations when we're advocating these transport messages. And I do have to shout out to the Australian Institute Centre for Future Work here because they've done great work in that space, particularly on the report on vehicle manufacturing in Australia. So I see I'm a little bit over time, so I will wrap up there, but we did identify quite a few opportunities and it was really great chance just to summarise this broad and evolving transport sector and really exciting to see the energy and interest that's in this space. And really looking forward to continuing to build on this knowledge and pushing for strong action and transitioning to the sector into a more just zero emissions transport system.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Audrey. Audrey Quicke from the Australia Institute, big fan of all the work you're doing. So now I have the great pleasure to introduce you to Claire Painter. So Claire, who's just moved office and apologises for potentially poor internet, is the head of business development at JetCharge, an organisation that's doing awesome work connecting players to the infrastructure they need to electrify the transport system in Australia. And she shared positive news that they've doubled in size in the last 12 months, which is a really great thing to see. So JetCharge designs, distributes, installs and manages electric vehicle charging solutions nationwide. And prior to JetCharge, Claire has a wealth of experience from time at Mercedes-Benz Australia, leading their transition to electric mobility, Climate Works, where she was involved in establishing the Electric Vehicle Council, among many other achievements, I'm sure. Thanks so much for joining us, Claire.
Thank you, Lisa. Thanks for the introduction and good morning, Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm joining from Boonwurrung country in southeast Melbourne. We've just moved offices, so I had to double check I had my information right, but we're all settling in here at the moment. And Audrey, great summary, great report that you guys have put together. I think it really sums up where things are at. In thinking about what to speak with you all today about transport policy, where we're at, what we need to do to create a better and more climate resilient transport system in Australia, my mind automatically went to all the kind of innovative, exciting transport technologies that we can see on the horizon and how to ensure that they come through. And in particular, looking at that interface of transport policy and energy policy. That's a really interesting space at the moment, how we can support these new technologies coming through and how do we enable them with easy policy? How do we set that up? And the example that I got thinking about was, how do we enable this future where if you've got an electric vehicle, you'll be able to drive to your local train station, plug your car into an EV charger there, which is powered by solar sitting on the train station roof. You go into work via public transport, come home, pick up your car, you've got a full battery charge from solar. You go home, you plug your car into your house and you power your house from that. So this is stuff that does seem light years away, but it's happening already. There's trials happening already. Vehicle to grid is something that's just, it's the technology is there, the policy is there to enable it. And it's something that is slowly starting to come through more and more. And so I was thinking about all this stuff, and then it led me back to transport policy basics. And it got me thinking about, as we come to a federal election, it's really the basic transport policy asks that have not been met and haven't been met for a really long time. And in terms of what a national transport policy should look like, we know what it is. The research that came out of what Audrey's put together and with ClimateWorks as well, these are all policy asks that have been asked for a number of years now. There's nothing new in here. There's nothing sneaky. The policy asks are really standard, and they're policy asks that have already been implemented in most countries overseas. And it brought me back to, and I feel like I say this over and over again, but fuel efficiency standards and CO2 emission standards for vehicles is really a cornerstone policy for transport. Without that, we're not going to unlock all the cool stuff that is sitting just on the horizon. And the reason I say that is, and Audrey touched on this a little bit, and I think it still blows my mind to think about it, that we have efficiency standards for every appliance we have in our home, but we don't have one for our vehicles. And at the moment, there's nothing kind of monitoring or controlling that. And so there's no way to improve it without having a standard set and the guidelines around that. And when I think about the importance of this policy, the things that I see in terms of transport policy, there's the kind of carrot and the stick approach. Vehicle emission standards are that stick approach. They're the thing that is going to drive manufacturers to bring new models to market. So at the moment, manufacturers will only bring new models to market if they have to. It'll also bring volume to market. So at the moment, you get manufacturers launching a new vehicle, and it may not have volume sitting behind it because that's being diverted to a country that has emission standards in place that they need to meet. So it's going to drive model availability, it's going to drive volume. And in doing and increasing volume, that's going to start putting downward pressure on pricing. So through kind of efficiencies in scale, manufacturers are going to start being able to reduce the price on EVs to the market. So that's kind of the stick approach, let's set a standard and actually get the vehicles into market. And then the other policies that Audrey touched on around purchase incentives and support for smart charging going into homes. This is the carrot approach. This is going to drive demand for the electric vehicles that the manufacturers are bringing in. And you've got to have both. The manufacturers, if you set a standard, they will bring the models to market, the volume to market, so that they don't get penalised. But what they need to see from a government policies perspective is that the demand from consumers is going to be there if they bring that in. And that's where those incentive policies really are going to support the demand side of it. But the reality is, at the moment, the demand is there based on all the vehicles that are coming into market. They're being sold, and there's wait lists that stretch 12, 18 months at the moment. So that it brought me back to that real kind of core policy ask has got to be fuel efficiency standards, CO2 standards. And I think once we solve that, that's an unlock all the cool technology options that we have sitting in the future. So that's where my mind went to, and I'm happy to take questions on that. The one thing, and I jumped into this and didn't give you guys background on jet charge. I think I was excited to talk about transport policy, which is, whenever I speak to most of my friends and families or even colleagues about transport policies, I can see their eyes start to glaze over very quickly. So I always love being able to come along and talk to people about it that have an interest in it. But just a little bit of background on jet charge as well, because I skipped over that. So jet charge is is Australia's largest electric vehicle charging company. I say that, but I'm aware that there's lots of EV charging companies that I think make that claim now. But I think for jet charge, we've been in the market for almost a decade now. So we've been doing electric vehicle charging installations for all of that time. And with that time comes the experience and how to solve the complexities of EV charging. So we do everything from providing education and consulting support right up front for people that are trying to understand how to transition a fleet to electric, through to designing solutions. We do one-off residential installations. We partner with every car manufacturer that has an EV in market to support their customers. And everything from that kind of small one-off charger all the way to working with governments and bus companies looking to transition their fleet to electric and setting up their depots for that, because that's kind of significant scale EV charging. So that's what we do. We cover Australia now. We have offices in every state and also in New Zealand. And our staff we're now at 115 people. I think when I started, I was number 56. And that was 10 months ago. So we're rapidly growing. And we also utilise a network of contractors. So we use local staff to install, or local people to install charging. And we use a subcontractor network of about 200 at the moment. So I'll stop there because otherwise I'll keep chatting, but welcome any questions as well.
Thank you so much, Claire. And yeah, it's really about normalizing and getting that new future for, yeah, I'm imagining with your comment on energy efficiency standards are already all throughout our home for our appliances. So looking forward to the day where I can, think about the secondhand car or car I'll buy with that star sticker on it. That'll be nice. So now I have the pleasure to introduce you all to Professor Peter Newman, who is, I'm sure, someone that many of you on the call today know. So Professor Newman is a professor of sustainability at Curtin University in Perth, where it's raining at the moment. And he shared with us earlier that there's lots of beautiful wildflowers coming out now over in WA. So that sounds beautiful. And Peter is a globally renowned writer and academic. He's got over 20 books and more than 350 papers published on sustainable cities. And he just finished the transport chapter to the recent climate change mitigation IPCC report, AR6, that he was leading. So that was 3 years of Peter's life, and he's very happy to finally be taking a breath and relax a little bit after that huge accomplishment. And also, make sure you take a look at Peter's recent article that we put up. I think it was just accepted by the conversation, so will be published there soon. But it also addresses the great question posed in the Q&A by Sebastian on our focus for reducing car usage overall. So encouraging electrification of all modes of transport. So it's great to have you joining us and sharing some of your wisdom and insights with us, Peter.
Thank you. And yes, I'm on Whadjuk Noongar country and very happy to be here. I need to share my screen so that I can put up a one diagram from the report, which we've just finished on transport. As part of, there's 23 chapters in the new mitigation report that's come out. There's one on demand, which is for the first time, and it covers a lot of the things that have been raised about reducing car use overall. It was also in our chapter. And there was another one on cities, which is important as well for transport. But the key thing here is that there has been an extraordinary change in the last 10 years. I've been involved in IPCC for 10 years, and we couldn't see 10 years ago the dramatic reduction in the cost of solar and wind, but solar in particular, and now the dramatic cost in the cost reduction in batteries. And that has led to the electric vehicles becoming more and more adopted across the world and are now seen to be taking over. So we had to do all the science on the full life cycle assessments and so on. And EVs come out dramatically better than anything else. And I have to say, dramatically better than hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. There is a bit of fog around the hydrogen area because it's so connected to gas and so on that these are just as equivalent as electric vehicles. They're not. They're 3 to 4 times more costly because the thermodynamics of the hydrogen storage and distribution is always going to be a great difficulty. So we can now see that all forms of electric vehicles are going to be the future with solar as their basis. That means recharging with solar is going to make very cheap and very effective net zero transport for the land systems. And the one on the left is showing that in the next 5 years, we'll see the world adopt electric vehicles of all kinds. Now, this has to include the micro mobility of bikes and scooters and auto rickshaws and so on that are rapidly taking it up, as well as heavy vehicles. Heavy vehicles were seen to be not suitable for electric. They're working. In Western Australia, all the big mining companies are now procuring not just mining trucks that are electric, but all of their equipment and electric freight trains. So the big ore truck trains and so on, they are switching because they're diesel electric systems and you just need the big battery that replaces the diesel part. So it's very easy to switch over, and that's significantly better. So don't get drawn into that analysis that somehow says, oh, we need a hydrogen distribution network equivalent to the electric one. You can't do that. It's not going to work and it's far too expensive, but it is also not necessary for land. But the transport for international shipping and aviation is not going to be covered by electric. You can do it with smaller ships and planes, but the long distance is not yet available. Everything is available on the market, in the showrooms for the electric land transport. But shipping and aviation needs another 15 years of work to get the R&D that will, and the demonstrations. There are starting to be some of them. But the key thing there is that hydrogen strategies need to be about regional industries like green steel, green aluminium and so on, which uses the hydrogen right where you make it. And that then can be exported out through regional ports. And some hydrogen left over can be used for creating shipping and aviation hydrogen fuels eventually. So that's not ought to be the strategy. And we shouldn't forget that part of the transport side of things. It is big and growing. It's out of control, really. But the part in the middle is demand. And we do need to have integrated strategies in two key ways. Firstly, integrated with land development. The transport land use integration has been my life for 40 or 50 years, and we can show how to reduce significantly the need for cars and the need for any kind of transport. Walking and cycling locally can be built into cities, and there's very significant reductions there. If we have very cheap electric vehicles charged by solar, which is the cheapest form of energy that the world has ever seen, our cities are going to be terrible. They will be consumed by too many vehicles. So we must simultaneously have strategies to make our buses, our trams, our trains fully electric and fully solar-based, but much more effective by having strategies that integrate with land development. So we've got research projects right across Australia that are now working on net zero corridors, where you can create the opportunity with electric transit systems that are built around net zero stations and precincts where you share solar. So sharing solar is the other thing. You've got to integrate into sharing mechanisms. That's how you do affordable housing and affordable living at these station precincts. These are where the density should be now focusing, not way out in the outer suburbs where it's so difficult to get anywhere and where the problems of poverty are being exacerbated at the moment. So two key things in demand: integrate with land and integrate with smart technology systems that enable you to share solar and electric vehicles, and of course share public transport and active transport. All of that can be done in new kinds of ways, but that requires really good demonstrations of how to do that. And we've got developers across Australia keen to show that now. So that is our story in a quick overview, and it is, there's a lot of hope in there. We can do things in transport that we've not been able to do in the last 10 years, but we've got to do it quickly now. This is the opportunity to really get going. So that's my story. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Peter. I'll just ask if you can also stop sharing your screen. A lot of hope there, and thank you. That graphic really demonstrates beautifully the importance of doing the work where we can to shift those areas of the transport system to zero emissions in the next 15 years, while the R&D comes online for the harder to abate areas of transport, shipping and aviation. So thank you so much for that very brief insight to what is a wealth of knowledge in that amazing brain of yours, working on these issues for many years. Hoping you can stay connected to those across the network to keep these discussions going too beyond today. So now I have the pleasure to introduce you all to Kellie Court. So Kellie is our final panelist for today. She is the Program Director of Climate and Energy at the Australian Council of Social Service, and brings more than 10 years experience developing and advocating for climate solutions. With transport, we've heard there's a lot of technology and electrification solutions around personal vehicles and other areas that deliver a lot of co-benefits for well-being and health and reducing congestion and air pollution in many of the areas we all live and work. But there's also a potential risk of leaving a lot of Australians behind and a lot of people globally in the transport transition. So Kellie has been leading some amazing work at ACOS with their Fair, Fast and Inclusive Climate Change Action. And yeah, it's great to have your perspectives as part of this conversation today, Kellie.
Thanks, Lisa. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm actually on Gadigal lands today. I'm normally where you are, Lisa. So I'd like to pay my respect to First Nations peoples and leaders past, present and emerging. Also thanks to Audrey and your colleagues for the report and the presentation. I think it's a really useful piece of work, and I've really enjoyed hearing from Claire and Peter as well. And I really appreciate, Audrey and Peter, you also called it out, the gaps in recognising that we need to ensure that people experiencing disadvantage aren't left behind. And it's an area that ACOS and our members are very conscious about, and we need to do more in the space of transport. We've focused a lot around electricity and gas. So I'm not going to come to you today with here's exactly what we need to do. I think, as Audrey said, we need to be working together to developing these policies, and our sector is really keen to engage in that. I did want to say that, just to give context for those that aren't familiar with the ACOS work or haven't heard me bang on about this many times, climate change impacts and a slow, poorly managed transition to zero emissions impacts people experiencing financial and social disadvantage first, worst and longest. And it's because they don't have the power, capacity, choice, means to cope, adapt and recover from impacts, but also to take advantage of new technologies that can help reduce costs of living as we go through the transition. So ACOS has a really strong position that we need to reduce emissions this decade and put in place a fair and inclusive plan to achieve those emission reductions. And we think that if we get it right, we can improve the lives for everybody. So for example, there's opportunity to create more affordable and healthier energy, housing, transport and jobs. But if we get it wrong, we can entrench and increase poverty and inequality. And I'll just quickly use the electricity as an example, because this is where we've done the most work. People on low income spend 4 times as much of their income on electricity and gas. I actually don't know what it is for fuel, for transport. Most people on low incomes live in inefficient homes and can't afford, or if they rent, don't have the control to access energy efficiency measures, rooftop solar, let alone household batteries. And what's more, the cost of recovery of many of the subsidies, like the SRES, for example, small scale renewable energy scheme, are recovered from energy bills. So it means that people on low income are, paying to help people access some of these technologies. And so, while there is broad community benefits for people putting on solar, and this will apply to uptake of electric vehicles, there's also significant direct individual benefits. And as I said, we've got this risk of increasing inequality. So for the most part, solar owners already own a home. So they've got an asset. They're getting access to a subsidy to put solar on their roof, which will significantly reduce their bills. And now in this election, we're seeing policies to subsidise batteries, which will predominantly go to the same people who are already benefiting from the solar subsidies. And then, we've got all these people that are being left out that can't access. So we need better targeted subsidies and cost recovery. For example, we could be targeting public and community housing and First Nations housing and communities in terms of access to solar batteries, those sorts of things first. So we're still achieving our emission reductions, but we're making sure people the least are put at the front of the solution. And the same risk exists for transport. So Yeah, so, you know, where we're talking about subsidies and tax incentives, these again will predominantly benefit people that can already afford to access electric vehicles. And in my quick and dirty research that I've sort of been doing on and off over the last few months, no country has really got the settings right yet, including, you know, we talk about Norway is often put up. I think they've got something like 85% penetration with the highest uptake of electric vehicles, but it's people in low income that have been left behind in Norway as well. So, and I think there are things we can do to bring overall price down that's discussed in the paper, which will help and we would support, like emission standards. It just blows my mind that we haven't gone there yet. It's just absurd, to be honest, and criminal, really. Reducing import taxes, free rego, and creating the second-hand market through government and fleet purchases. You know, all those things I think are important, but they won't on their own be enough to ensure people in low incomes will be able to afford EVs, and there's a risk that they'll be left behind with cars that are high cost to run, right? We can just see it. 80% of the population, electric vehicles, people on low income left with petrol, diesel cars, high cost fuel, and, you know, really struggling. And I think a highlight, recently NatSam did a bit of analysis of ACT policy. And thanks to my colleague Jeff at ACOS for sending this paper through to me. I thought it was really interesting. The ACT offers 3 incentives. They've got full exemption on stamp duty on purchase, 2-year free registration, and 0 interest loans of up to $15,000 for eligible households. I'm just going to focus on 2 points of the NatSam research, and I'll put a link to it in the chat for people after I finish talking. The first thing they found is that high-income households are far more likely to replace their cars within 5 years and far more likely to switch to electric vehicles, even without incentives. And that essentially incentives don't make a difference for them. So for a start, we should be targeting our subsidies. I mean, you know, why would we be making it available for everyone when it's really clear from the data that there's a whole group of people that are going to be purchasing them anyway. And the other thing that they found is that 0 interest loans combined with the cheaper EVs is what will drive EV uptake for low-income households. So, you know, better targeting the subsidies to people that need it and providing no interest loans are going to be important. I think, and at some stage, we're probably going to have to think about things like cash for clunkers. I don't know if people remember there was a policy quite a few years ago to for people to get rid of their most inefficient cars. But at some stage, we're going to have to start thinking about those sorts of policies as well. We also need to ensure charging stations are built in low socioeconomic areas and doing that early so that people feel like they can, you know, their next purchase will be an electric vehicle if they know that they've got the infrastructure in their area. But we also need to concentrate more on accessible public and non-ownership transport. And in particular, how do we do that better in urban and regional areas where public transport is really lacking? And I agree with Peter that we need to include measures like local area public transport and the rental share cars and driverless cars. What happened to driverless cars? I feel like that's all we talked about 4 years ago, and you know, which, you know, those sorts of things can really improve accessibility for people as well as cheaper transport. So look, in conclusion, I think we should ensure that we don't inadvertently increase inequality as we transition to a clean economy, and that we should be focused on improving lives. And to do that, we need to put this equity and inclusiveness lens over policy development with a goal to improve the lives of everybody. There's a real opportunity here for us, I think, if we get the policy setting right. Okay, thanks.
Thanks so much, Kellie. So much important work being done, and so many excellent solutions, well thought through, that are already on the table, ready for the picking. So that's really positive to just hear a few little bits of the opportunities ahead. So thank you to all of our excellent panelists for their insights. Now we do have 4 or 5 questions that have been posted in the chat. Given timing, I'm going to consolidate those into one question back to our panelists and invite 2-minute final statements back to us all to send us away motivated and inspired to solve these challenges over the year ahead and put us on track as we are well into this critical decade. So we've had questions from Sebastian, Lindsay, Ajaya and Beth. This element definitely for Peter, the question just around car dependency generally and the potential to see the Australian public shift to other modes of transport, given the culture and behaviour changes associated with that. Also a question directed to Claire, but I'm sure many of you have insights on this. What do you see as the prospects for fuel efficiency standards being adopted if there is a change of government or maybe the status quo? So how can we make this a non-partisan issue? And a positive note to finish on, the general policy asks put forward in the scoping study, and many of the issues discussed today are fairly standard, and many working in the space have a good understanding of these. But if you were to share a cool thing that is on the horizon for transitioning Australia's transport system to a zero emissions alternative, what would that be? So maybe I'll hand to Audrey to kick us off.
Oh, wow, where to start? Lots of questions there. Firstly, there was one about fuel efficiency standards. Just quickly, there was an emergency fuel security summit that I attended last week that was hosted by the Smart Energy Council, and absolutely everybody that was there was talking about fuel efficiency standards. So that was really great to see. I think a lot of the teal independents, so-called teal independents, are putting forward and moving towards fuel efficiency standards. So I do think that it's inevitable that we're going to move in that direction. I just wanted to touch on a couple of the things quickly that Kellie was speaking about. When we're talking about those equity aspects in our EV policy, Kellie, you were talking about targeting those incentives towards lower income households, which you absolutely should be doing, capping them, so not offering them to high income earners. A couple of others that would make a real difference, I think, to those electric vehicle incentives are providing the incentive at the point that the vehicle is purchased, so you don't have to come up with that $3,000 yourself and then get it rebated. And then also offering them to second-hand vehicles is a massive one. So the ACT saw this. I think originally it wasn't offered towards second-hand vehicles, and they realized that, they rectified that, and it makes a massive difference if you can use that $15,000 no interest loan to put towards a $20,000 car that you've gotten through something like the Good Car Company. So lots of different things that we could be doing there to make these policies more equitable. And in terms of something exciting, I think just the V2G, that vehicle to grid capability, particularly some of the projects that we're seeing happening at the ANU here in Canberra, where they're looking at, you know, could people potentially be paid to put some of that electricity back into the grid at points of high demand. So lots of exciting stuff happening, and I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Audrey, and we'll jump to Claire.
Thank you. And really great questions. Thank you. And I've been keeping an eye on the chat as we've been chatting as well. There was a question around the difference between fuel efficiency standards and CO2 standards. And I think you're testing all my memory here on when I used to talk about this day in, day out. Fuel efficiency standards are the Euro 5, 6 rating that we have, which is how efficiently a car runs. CO2 standards is how much CO2 or other emissions are emitted from the vehicle in operating. CO2 standards are what we're missing. We do have fuel efficiency standards, but they need to be increased to be in line with global standards. Audrey, is that right?
So fuel efficiency standards and CO2 standards, same thing.
Yeah.
Emission standards are the Euro 6 ones.
Yeah.
They're the ones that we've got. Fuel efficiency and CO2 standards, the ones that we don't have.
There we go. So I just wanted to clarify that. There was a question from Lindsay on what's the probability of something getting over the line if there is a change in government. I remain eternally hopeful that one day someone will have the guts and see the light to go, this is a policy that we need. But I never like to predict things one way or the other, because I've seen it where we've gotten very close to implementing something, and then there's always a change in political winds, and then there it goes. So eternally hopeful, but we'll wait and see. And then the question around cool future new stuff, and I think it ties into what you said, Kellie, around autonomous driving. Where did that go? I think it's, you know, and Audrey, you're right, vehicle to grid, that seems to be the thing that people are latching onto at the moment. You know, how do we bring that to life? And I think that's the new policy, which has transitioned from autonomous vehicles. The interesting thing is the technology is there in all of those cool new things. It's always just how they're enabled into the market. So for autonomous vehicles, the technology is there. Most car companies have autonomous vehicles features to some degree. It's the policy around it as to how it's enabled in the market, and that's what's held up. With vehicle to grid, you're right, Audrey, there's some really cool trials happening at the moment. So JetCharge is involved in the smart charging trial, which is how do you kind of load manage people's charges for them? So we're doing that, and also the vehicle to grid charger as well. So how do you kind of incentivize people to use their charging assets and their vehicle assets in different ways to support the grid?
Thanks, Claire. Peter.
Yeah, the car dependency issue, I have put into the chat a new ebook that we've produced that is free. It's called Greening the Greyfields, and it is about how to do net zero corridors and precincts. It's all about precincts. If we are only doing individual houses rather than precincts, we'll miss the benefits of this new technology in solar, which is best done in a shared way. Batteries, community batteries, and electric vehicles can be shared. They can be part of a recharge system in a precinct that it enables people to share them and the benefits from them, as well as having in precincts things like electric shuttles that are on demand and can be shared from that area to the train station or the shopping centre, local systems. And we have to just see that the electric vehicle is not just something for the rich. At the moment it is, and it is certainly better. It is significantly better as a form of mobility. There's nothing quite like it in terms of quality. Those qualities can be channeled into all these other forms of transport, particularly things like trackless trams and buses and electric shuttles, and the things like electric bikes and so on. All of those are going to be able to provide us not just a carbon-free future, but a car-free future. You can do that together, and therefore it'll be much more equitable and a much better city will emerge. But you do need to plan that, integrate it, and there are ways now emerging of how to share it so that it is done in a shared way. That is, we've got firms now that are exporting their technology for sharing solar and sharing electric vehicles, sharing batteries in a way that is setting us up to be a major provider to the world of that kind of technology. So we need to do that. That's smart stuff, but it is very much based in a more equitable and resilient society. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. Kellie.
Oh, look, I think Audrey, Claire and Peter summed up, responded to the questions really well. And I just want to echo, yes, when I was talking about autonomous vehicles, I was thinking more along the lines of what Peter's talking about, because, I mean, it would be really fascinating what can be done at that local level with autonomous vehicles, which can really help with accessibility and emissions. So I'm really keen to read that book, Peter, because I think there'll be some really great gems in that as well.
Yeah, and sorry, there was one other question there about critical minerals, and I just need to say it's mostly nonsense and mythological that these minerals are going to be running out. They are very small in requirements. Australia is now by far the biggest provider of these critical minerals. They're not coming any longer from ecologically difficult brine lakes in South America, or the cobalt coming from DCR with human slaves. It is not, that is basically being put forward by people like Matt Canavan as a way to try and stop this transition. It is real nonsense behind it. It did start as a myth coming from oil companies. We have covered all of that, the science of that, in the IPCC report. Have a look at it, it's clear. But I've tried to get publishing on this in the conversation and so on, but I'll eventually get there.
Great suggestion. Thanks, Peter. We've all got a lot of reading to do. And thank you to all of our excellent panelists, Audrey, Rachel, who can't be here today, for the work she put into that scoping study as a resource for us all to keep building on. Claire, with the amazing work you're doing at Jet Charge, and Professor Newman. Peter, your wealth of knowledge is invaluable to these discussions. And Kellie, thank you for all you're doing. Together, you've all offered glimpses of a different, possible, better future for our transport systems today. And you've each highlighted that as a country, we have choices and mitigation options ahead that will put us on that lower emissions pathway and build a climate resilient, healthy, better, more prosperous future for us all. So those of you on the call who joined us, thank you for listening in and for all your excellent questions. If you're not yet connected into Better Futures Australia, please do reach out to share how you'd like to be involved in a society and economy-wide approach to realising zero emissions opportunities for Australia. And together we'll do our fair share under the Paris Climate Agreement and keep as close to that 1.5 trajectory as we can. Thank you all for all you're doing. Looking forward to the follow-up discussions from today. And thank you to Peter and Kellie for those excellent resources shared in the chat today. All the best. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.